Hi, we're here to talk about the seven faces of Walt Disney and ask a bigger question. Who is just like Walt Disney? The Heil Hitler, the Simon Legree, the Mickey Mouse, mouse spelled with a dollar sign, Beelzebub. Like, take a guess. Who do you think is more like Walt Disney? Maybe you didn't know this side of Walt Disney. Hi, I'm Professor David Michael Boje, and I want to talk to you about who uses grand narrative, who uses living stories. One of these candidates for presidents uses a lot of living stories, and the other one uses a lot of grand narratives. And I'd like to hear your comments. Give it a subscribe, give it a like, give it a share, put in a comment, and I'll try to respond. So critics of grand narrative include Jacques Derrida, Hannah Arendt, and Jean-Francois Lyotard. We'll look at each of them and how they approach the notion of the grand narratives used by our political leaders, our corporations, and people running for president. So first, Jacques Derrida says a grand narrative is a violent instrument of torture. That's like pretty extreme, right? It imprisons life and other voices. But when you look into grand narrative in the work of Jacques Derrida, you find that that's pretty true. Hannah Arendt pointed out that it was ideology. The totalitarian regimes can only prevail if the masses are able to accept a grand narrative transcending a face value understanding of reality. Now, I don't want to tip the scales on who you're voting for president, but we've had some pretty whopper grand narratives presented to us. Jean-Francois Lyotard is a critic of grand narratives, wrote a book on it, preferred 1,000 little, what I call living stories to be set free and bloom. Jacques Derrida says, and he uses the word living story, is an alternative to these corporate narratives, the political speak of our leaders, seeking to impose a coherent, linear narrative on events with a beginning, a middle, and an end, also called the progress narrative. Derrida's living story embraces ambiguity, multiplicity, and an ongoing process of construction. This is what I wrote about in the 2001 book. My first chapter is on Derrida and deconstructing grand narratives. Another chapter on grand narratives with Jean-Francois Lyotard taking the lead. And through the book is about indigenous living stories, which are a little different than what Jacques Derrida proposes as living stories. It's about a context, a place that is sacred, a time to tell, and an aliveness of all its own, and it's about sustainability. Now let's give it an example of a grand narrative that we've been all duped by. I don't know, I used to grow up watching Walt Disney, this smiling grandfatherly face. He didn't even sign his own signature. The whole thing was fake. And I wanted to show you how that grand narrative, as applied in Jean-Francois Lyotard, I did a publication on it. It's my most famous publication. I want to talk about performativity, voices, marginalizations, totalisms, universalisms, essentialisms, Walt's panoptic gaze of surveillance, and my own contribution to Tomorrowland. That's a lot of jargon, so let's break it down. What is a grand narrative? Well, modern organizations, particularly a large-scale one like Walt Disney Corporation, erects grand narratives of technological progress and performativity. You better perform or they're going to yank that costume off of you and kick you out of the employees of the park. And there's a panoptic gaze of surveillance. When you work in the Disney theme park, they got like head boys and head girls, and they rat you out to the administration. Even when you're having a party on your off time, there's a lot of surveillance in the Disney theme parks and Disney organization, particularly on Walt's time of administration. Hopefully it's gotten a little better. If you work for Disney, hey, give me a comment or send me a private email. Performativity, big word. Lyotard introduced the idea of conversation, what we in true storytelling call conversational storytelling, as a root metaphor of organizational studies. And Grace Ann Roselle and I wrote a book on this, conversational storytelling as a methodology. But the performativity is more in the bureaucratization. It's the outer limit of the performative tendency, Lyotard tells us. A bureaucracy always requires supplemental constraints, statements to be declared admissible within the bounds. In other words, you can only say certain things in a bureaucracy or you're fired. The constraints function to filter discursive potentials, whatever that is. Performativity also privileges certain classes of statements. There are things that should be said in a bureaucracy, and there are ways of saying them. Orders in the army, prayers in the church, lessons in the school, narration in the families, performativity in businesses. And we're going to look more closely at it. Who's got a voice in a bureaucracy, in Walt Disney, in the Republican campaign, the Democratic campaign, in any corporation or university? Who's got the voice? I'll tell you, I worked for universities for almost 40 years, and I didn't have a voice. And they're not writing my story. They're not erecting a statue to me. You know, it's the chancellor, the provost, people who gave big money for buildings. But anyway, at Walt Disney, the official Disney discourse rarely allowed any voice other than Walt's voice to be heard. Walt even referred to his wife as Mrs. Disney, didn't call her Lily. He may have done so out of formality to his generation, but I don't think so. Walt took ownership of everything about Disney Enterprise, just like one of our presidential candidates takes ownership of everything, and everything is about him or, oh, I gave it away, or about her, I should have said. My brothers, my uncles, my fathers, my daughters, my pal, are all references Walt made, giving no personal name to any of the people referenced. Whoa. I bet you didn't know that about Walt Disney. Marginalizations. Jack Kinney, marginalized character at the Disney studios, an artist who did not get to sign his own work, offers one of the very few glimpses of the non-official side of Walt Disney. Walt had a stenographer record story meetings. Walt would tap his desk to get, you'd hear this sound. Let me make a sound. If he tapped really fast, you better speed up your presentation, Bubba. If he slowed down, you better slow it down, because Walt's paying attention. Hurry up, slow it down, according to the tap. A typical story performance session can last from 1 to 3 hours. Imagine the pressure of that. If you're Jack Kinney, the artist, in 3 hours, or any of the hundreds of artists that Walt did this to. Walt not only gauged the story plots for salability, but also assessed the neatness of the storyboards he required everybody to present. Totalisms, there's a big word. Totalism is a historical account that privileges one relatively narrow point of view. You find that a lot in grand narratives. Ron Miller, the son-in-law, became CEO of the Walt Disney Studios after Walt died, but the ghost of Walt remained. During Miller's administration, people would often say, what would Walt have done? They didn't pay much attention to Ron Miller, trained as an accountant, not a great storyteller. They would tell the story of how Walt handled a similar situation and didn't do it that way. People called Disney Studios the Mouse Museum, referring to both the perpetuation of the traditional Walt Midwestern PG style. And if you notice, Disney is not PG anymore, got all kinds of ratings. I don't think they do X though, right? There's no room at the top of Disney for both Ron and Walt. I looked at Michael Eisner. He succeeded Ron Miller. His approach to totalism, more paradoxical account. The paradoxical Eisner said that Walt's history, he would use it but attack it. So if it privileged him, he would use it. If it wasn't fitting for what Eisner wanted to do, he would attack it. Such statements revealed an alternative to the totalizing discourse, the challenge of the discourse. For example, Eisner will invoke Walt's legend and then challenge it in the same sentence. And every time I'd say, how was it done in the past? I'd hear about Walt. Well, I actually went in and listened to the tapes of Ron Miller and Walt Disney and Eisner. And, I got to hear the voices. Nobody ever got access to the Disney archives like I did. Oh, wait a minute. Who do I sound like? Never mind. But I did get access. They just thought, hey, who's going to, these tinny tapes with a handheld tape recorder? Yeah, it's got no commercial value. So they let me in. They let me record whatever I wanted of their archive. So universalism. So universal is a grand principle, a sweeping statement designed to gloss over differences in other accounts. Okay, I can't resist. You've heard from presidential candidates, particularly one of them, make these grand sweeping statements about immigrants, about all kinds of things, about body parts of golf players just recently. I mean, Walt had a universal vision of a vast empire. He saw his cartoons, characters, TV shows, and films as culminating in a theme park. And we give him credit for that. Theme park was based on Walt's visions of a small Midwestern town, one he knew as a boy, Disneyland. Walt's archetype of the ideal American town, the American dream. All facets of the Disney operation had to synergize. Take a chance, Walt said, already a grandfather at the time. If I am no longer young at age, I hope to stay young enough, in spirit, never to fear failure, young enough to still take a chance and march in the parade. I mean, this sounds pretty great as a grand narrative, right? But we're going to get deeper into it. So hold on to your hats. The universals here are also the ways in which Michael Eisner reshaped the story of Disney to fit a particular vision of Disney, the corporation, how it reacts to change, how Disney, the man, would have welcomed the creative genius of George Lucas. Would he? Eisner is reshaping the grand narrative to send Disney down its new path, and so is the current CEO. Now let's get at essentialism. I love this drawing. This is amazing, right? It says Walt is like Simon Legree, the Führer, the bountiful angel. He's beloved benefactor, dropping the crumbs down to those who worship him. He's the Ebenezer Scrooge. He's the devil Beelzebub. He's Mickey Mouse. I mean, which presidential candidate does that remind you of? Do I have to spell it out for you? Similar to the universal, except an essentialism is a micro-theory, an appeal to a fundamental, essential human character. Several essentialisms of Walt, the character, accepted risk, make a change, like a young man, be a creative genius. So these are characterizations that Disney Corporation still accentuates. But these characterizations were held out to the employees, investors, and public as norms. But behind the scenes, people knew from the living story just what was the true story here. Walt was all of these things: Simon Legree, the Führer, the bountiful angel, Mr. Nice Guy, Ebenezer Scrooge. I mean, who was he going to be today? Beelzebub, the devil? People did not believe they were allowed to speak about the oppression they were enduring by this grand narrative, essentialism. And most non-official accounts, Walt is said to have ruled with an iron fist. If anybody disagreed with Walt, they're fired. Who does that remind you of? Employees who broke a rule, Walt's, would be fired. Everything was owned by Walt Disney Productions. It was all about Walt. Walt had a panoptic gaze, the gaze of surveillance, right? Is what Michel Foucault writes about. And he traces the history of the panoptic gaze. In a prison that had a tower in the center of it, you could have these windows and you could see out, but the prisoners couldn't see you. So might have 8 levels, 8 stories of prisoners in a circle in their cells. And one guard could go up and look out the windows into the cells, and you wouldn't know which floor or which cell that guard was looking at. So you had to behave. That's the power of the panoptic gaze. So, come May 29th, 1941, 293 employees went on strike. Walt was freaking out. The Disney Studios public image, one big, happy, harmonious family, was being shattered by 1,000 picketers, right, supporting the 293 strikers. So Walt's employees were growing skeptical of the family metaphor. The rationalized system of administration was being challenged. An inner circle was thought to have privileges, the men. Others, the women, were not enjoying. Skepticism was more apparent given the studio's use of such control practices. Get this, using time clocks, not just when you arrived or left work, but when you got a drink of water, when you made a trip to the bathroom, or you sharpened your little pencil. Oh my gosh, the guy's a tyrant. Walt believed his family members had betrayed him and fired 20 strikers on the spot. He took pictures of every striker and taped them to the wall of his office. He then systematically fired them. And managers who agreed with them, those women that were underpaid, less than half or more of what the men were paid. And the men didn't like it any more than the women liked it. And so they stood up to Walt. Walt jumped out of his car. His brother Roy had to restrain him. He started to do fist fights with the striking people, hopefully the men, not the women. So Roy shipped him off to South America to film beavers and squirrels and whatnot. Get him out of town, out of Hollywood, till he cooled down. Well, he never cooled down. So that brings me to Tomorrowland. This is the innovation I brought to the analysis of Disney. So this is a play in which you're handed a passport. It's in the 1920s when Mussolini is coming to power. And you kind of forget that as you go into the play. It's kind of like a whodunit mystery. You know, at the end, the lights go out and you have to say, who done it? I don't know. I didn't see it. I attended the play. I followed the chauffeur from the kitchen to the maid's bedroom. And then as she met the butler who had just entered the drawing room. So I'm going from room to room, trailing different characters. The audience splits up. They go to different rooms. The point of the whole thing on Tomorrowland is you can't be in all the rooms at once. And you kind of talk to people as you're going between rooms, and they have a dinner break and you talk about it over dinner. It doesn't help. You can't figure out this play. No audience member gets to follow all the stories since the action is simultaneously in a dozen different rooms. Actors are acting in a dozen rooms. You have to choose which room are you going to go to. There's a certain indeterminacy of each character. It makes it more complicated. Some are spies for Mussolini. Others are in support of this fellow who's under house arrest, who's a war hero who could oppose Mussolini and Mussolini wouldn't come to power. Could have changed all of history. So, yeah. Now, is this guy that I'm following having a love affair with the maid? Is he in love with his maid, or just using her to spy on their aristocracy? Or is he toying with her? Isn't it an exploitable subject? I mean, I couldn't figure it out. Tomorrowland cannot be understood on one visit, even if the audience member and a group of friends go to 6 different directions and share their story data. They're not in all the rooms. They're not going to figure it out. Tomorrowland, I think it's like every organization that has more than 2 or 3 rooms where there's storytelling of different characters going on, and you're in one of the rooms and you're trying to figure out what's going on in these other rooms, and what's this I'm hearing that just happened in a room I wasn't in. So let me just summarize it for you. Tomorrow, written by John Kruzak, is Los Angeles' longest running play. Dozen characters unfold their story before walking, sometimes running audience, splitting up, going to different rooms. It's Italy, January 10th, 1927. You get that passport. You know you're in the era of Mussolini, Gabriele Dall'Anisio, a poet patriot, also a war hero, a womanizer, a revolutionary, right? He's being kept in luxury, right? It's just so decadent. You know, wine, women, and song, because Mussolini wants to keep him out of the picture, keep him away from competing with Mussolini's bid for power among the black shirts gangs that he ran in Rome. Instead of remaining stationary, viewing a single stage audience fragments into small groups, chases characters room to room, floor to floor, into bedchambers, kitchens, and bathrooms. I mean, this is not like your ordinary sit in a theater and eat popcorn. If there are dozens of stages and dozens of storytellers, get this, and I'm going to blow your mind with a number here. What is the number of storylines an audience could trace choosing different room paths in this play? Well, 12 rooms, 12 factorial is 479 million combinations, more or less. That's a lot of combinations. And that's why when I say a complex organization like Disney Corporation is like Tomorrowland, I mean it. I mean, you're not following all the action in different theme parks around the world, different corporate buildings in Hollywood, in Orange County. You know, it's just a real big show to try to manage to the story you follow from room to room. You can't be in any more than one room at once. So let's talk about a different kind of living story as an alternative to grand narrative. It's indigenous living story. Vine Deloria Jr., for example, so many wonderful books writing about the power and place, the importance of the place, the land, the renewal of the land as being what living story is about. You learn a living story in a community, in a tribal community, in a clan. You grow up in that community, you know the living stories. And Kaylin Two Trees, Lakota, told me that, you know, Boje, the penalty for getting a living story wrong is death. Why is that? Why would it be so important to get a story right? Because it's the survival of the tribe. It's where the water is. You lie about where the water is, it affects the survival of the firm of Native Americans. Gregory Kahete and Leroy Little Bear write about living story. Gregory Kahete's book, with the foreword by Leroy Little Bear, both of whom have been keynote presenters at our conference, Kahete many times. I don't think he's missed hardly any conferences we have. And they happen in December. Hey, that's coming up. Gregory Kahete wrote the book Native Science, Natural Laws for Interdependence. The interdependence of all living things, the relations of all living things. And Leroy Little Bear presented on the quantum aspect of everything is related, waves or spirits. There's a spiritual ecology here that they're talking about. All right, so understand that the Derrida approach to living story and that of Leroy Little Bear and Greg Gahete, right? Vine Deloria. Don Pepione, who opens the conference every year, really good friend. And my good colleague, right, Kaylin Two-Trees. These are different. Each indigenous tribe would have a different living story on assembly. And we can look at living story, though, in our own life, how we grew up in a community, how we're aware of the land. We know what paths to take, what shortcuts to take. But it's more than that. It's about respect and renewal of the land. It's about a deep sense of sustainability. Now, who's a better storyteller here? Is it Kamala Harris or is it Donald Trump? Which one is using these grand narrative? Which one of these is using these living story approaches? So let's just talk about storytelling, give you an overview. Storytelling has three kinds of elements in it. There's grand narratives, and some of them you need because you need a direction and a path, okay? And then there's living stories. Okay, we talked about the Derrida approach to living stories. We talked about Lyotard, Let 1,000 Little Stories Bloom, right? We talked about Hannah Arendt's a critique of grand narrative, right? And we talked about indigenous living stories. Now, I contribute a third element. That's what I'm known for. I got some reputation for anti-narrative. ANTE stands for antecedent, and it's a partner to living story and to grand narratives or counter narratives in the following way. Anti-narrative is preparatory. It's a pre-story. It's developing the pre-story, developing the grand narrative. It's putting the pieces together. So you have this alternative. You go on toward living story, you tilt the anti-narrative processes one way. You go on towards grand narrative, you tilt it the other way. So you find out more at antinarrative.com about these processes that constitute the third element of storytelling. Now, I'm also part of the True Storytelling group, and I bring my anti-narrative processes, I'll show you in a minute, to bear on the 7 storytelling principles, true storytelling principles. I'll just read them off to you, and then we'll relate them to the anti-narrative processes, and whether we tilt toward grand narrative or we tilt toward living story. Of course, I tilt more toward living story. You'll see that. I admit it. Principle 1, you yourself must be true and prepare the energy and effort for a sustainable future. True storytelling makes spaces and respects the stories already there. You must create stories with a clear plot, creating direction and helping people prioritize. Now, that can turn into a grand narrative, so be careful. You must have timing. You must be able to help stories along on their way and be open to experiments. You must consider staging, including scenography and artifacts. This is what Annette Strand in Denmark calls material storytelling, how we tell stories with things. You can create a story without words. You can just assemble the things, or you can look at the story of my shirt. Is it too pretentious for this video? I don't know. So it's staging. We stage things, especially in corporations. I just told you about Walt Disney and his storyboards. He definitely staged things so to give you, the audience, a wonderful experience. You must reflect on the stories and how they create value. Okay, now what I've done, and I'll show you simplified, we'll go one by one, is combine the 7 principles of true storytelling with the 7 anti-narrative storytelling processes. I call them ASPs, and living stories, which I kind of tilt toward for an ethical organization. So what I've done is created arrows between. So principle 1 relates to anti-narrative 1, principle 2 to etc. Principle 7 to anti-narrative 7. But let's take them one at a time. True storytelling principle and preparatory, the preparing by anti-narrative processes of grand narratives, living story. So principle 1, you yourself must be true and prepare the energy and effort for a sustainable future. Okay. The anti-narrative, called the beneath, is to go beneath the beliefs, opinions, concepts, the linear corporate narrative, those grand narratives, to the living story. True storytelling principle number 2, making room. True storytelling, making room by respecting the stories already there. You ever gone on the carpet with the boss, and the boss just has his side of the story or the side of the story that she heard, if you have a female boss, and you don't get to tell your side of the story? I mean, I've been there. So the anti-narrative before is respecting the past little while moments of exceptions of living story wisdom. So little while moments are those little moments when you went against the grand narrative. You stood up to it. Maybe you didn't succeed fully, but if you collect enough of those historical little while moments, you can build a new story in a process we call restorying. And I'll show you that a little bit later. True storytelling principles and preparatory answer narrative processes. Principle 3, the plot. You must create stories with a clear plot, creating direction and helping people prioritize. Now, the anti-narrative, number 3, is bets. Bets on the future. To ante up. Ante up is a poker term for putting in money, investing. You put your money in the pot, it's no longer yours, it's the pot. You know, whoever wins the hand gets the money. But we want to ante up sustainable bets and the risks of those bets. Now, here's the point. There's more than one bet going on in an organization at the same time. It's Tomorrowland. So as many rooms as there are, you could have that many bets going on in those rooms about the future of the company and what future is arriving. What future is arriving? It's a bet on the future. It's not just rolling over the past into the future. It's not a general grand narrative up in the sky. This is actual investments in the future. Principle 4, true storytelling. You must have timing. Anti-narrative 4 is called being, and it's being in the living story of a place, a time, and aliveness. So it's a very much indigenous living story, but I think it also fits with Derrida's messiness of living stories too. That they're not all coherent, they're not all tied up in a linear map. They're not a progress grand narrative. You know, we don't believe those, do you? Do you believe those? I've been behind the scenes enough. I don't. Being is also an existential word. It's our existence in the world. Jean-Paul Sartre, Martin Heidegger, but also the kind of quantum approach to being that you see in the work of the feminist scholars such as Karen Barad, where space, time, and mattering, right, the place, time, and mattering of aliveness of vibrant matter, those are not separable in nature. It's we who try to split them out and dualize them. But go see Karen Baran's work on meeting the universe halfway. She got amazing videos, amazing books. Check them out. True storytelling principle, preparatory anti-narrative processes. Principle 5, help stories. You must be able to help stories along on their way, be open to experiment. Anti-narrative 5, becoming. Now, becoming is shot all the way through our life and being. It's always changing. Things are always shifting because we are a living story of change that is happening in our lives. And so, but we have a restoring process that will help you with this, and we'll get that in just a moment. Principle 6 of true storytelling is called staging. You must consider staging, including scenography and artifacts, right? That material storytelling. And number 6 is the between. We're in between the four who's, our egoistic who, our social who of our family and our peers, our corporate who, right? Or it's a university who or a governmental who, wherever we work, right? A nonprofit who, whatever it is. I just call it corporate who. And our echo who, our ecological who. So our true self, what is our true self? Do we even have a true self? Some psychologists say we don't have a true self. I believe that we do. And in true storytelling, we try to get to an authentic, genuine true self. And one of the ways we do that is to look at the four who's who are speaking in our ear and pulling us away from our true self. Right? I grew up in a family that, my parents didn't think I was college material. Hey, some of my teachers didn't think that either. But who knew? I graduated first in my class in college and a university. So that was pretty cool. So I have my true self, but is that true self just egotistical, wanting to be first in my class? Is it social? Want to impress my peers? Want to impress that corporateness of the university? Or is it ecologically? No, not at that time. It took me, I'm going to be 77 soon. It took me all these years to find my true self. See the video. I found my true self in Caballo, New Mexico, land of enchantment. Okay, now we're going to go to principle 7. Reflect. You must reflect on the stories and how they create value. Okay. Well, how do you reflect on stories? Well, the anti-narrative preparatory help here is called the Beyond, and it's that spiritual ecology of living stories. It's very much an indigenous approach to living stories, not quite a Derrida approach. It is the messiness of a Derrida approach. So I hope this has given you some insight. Got a few more things to say to you and show you a couple of things, but that's about it for now. Thank you. Give us a subscribe, give us a like, give us a share. If you put in a comment, I'm going to answer it if it's fun.